The distant edges of space were often quiet, but Captain Ethan Monroe preferred it that way. His ship, the Stellar Dawn, hummed softly as it glided through the void. A lone scavenger, Ethan spent his days collecting scrap and salvaging lost technology from abandoned planets. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him freedom. And freedom was something he valued more than anything. As he leaned back in his pilot's seat, sipping on a cup of lukewarm synth coffee, a sudden alert jolted him. The ship's console lit up, flashing a bright yellow indicator. It wasn't a standard alert. It was an SOS, a distress signal. Ethan frowned and leaned forward, scanning the message. The signal was weak, barely holding together, but its source was clear. D-37-4, an abandoned mining planet, a graveyard of rusted machinery and long-forgotten structures. No one lived there, at least not anymore. The miners had stripped the planet bare years ago and left it to rot. Why would someone send an SOS from a dead world? Ethan muttered to himself. Curiosity tugged at him. The logical thing to do was ignore it. People disappeared in space all the time, and getting involved often led to trouble. But Ethan had spent too many years in the military to ignore a cry for help. His moral compass wouldn't let him. All right, let's see what this is about, he said, setting a course for D-37-4. As the Stellar Dawn approached the planet, its dull gray surface came into view. The atmosphere was thick with dust storms, and the sunlight barely penetrated the haze. The planet looked as lifeless as the rumors claimed. Ethan descended cautiously, his ship's sensors guiding him toward the faint signal. Coordinates locked, the ship's AI announced in its flat, mechanical tone. Ethan landed near what appeared to be the remnants of an old mining facility. The structures were skeletal, their once sturdy metal frames now corroded and brittle. The wind howled outside, carrying with it particles of sand that scraped against the ship's hull. Grabbing his survival gear, Ethan stepped out into the harsh environment. His boots crunched against the dry, cracked ground as he followed the signal on his handheld tracker. The air was thick and heavy, even through his breathing mask. He moved quickly, his instincts alert. Years of experience told him that places like this weren't always as empty as they seemed. The signal led him to a large, rusted structure partially buried under layers of dust. It looked like some sort of storage facility, its entrance sealed shut. Ethan's tracker beeped louder as he approached. "This is it," he murmured. He inspected the door. The locking mechanism was ancient but still functional. It would take some effort to override it. Pulling out a portable hacking device, Ethan got to work. Sparks flew as the device hummed, forcing the door's systems to comply. With a loud groan, the heavy metal door slid open, revealing a dark interior. The signal grew stronger. Ethan's flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the space. Inside, rows of broken equipment and discarded crates littered the floor. At the center of the room stood a black box about the size of a small pod. Its surface was smooth, almost too pristine compared to its surroundings. The SOS was coming from inside. Ethan approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his plasma cutter. The box emitted a faint, rhythmic beeping. It wasn't just a container, it was a survival pod. "Who's in there?" he muttered, kneeling beside it. The pod's small display showed vital signs, weak but present. Someone was alive inside. Ethan's heart quickened. He searched for a way to open it, but the controls were locked. The pod was designed to protect its occupant, but it also made rescue more difficult. "All right, let's see if we can wake you up," he said, pulling out his tools. Minutes felt like hours as Ethan worked to override the pod's security. Finally, with a hiss of air, the lid unsealed and slid open. Inside was a figure curled up tightly, covered in a tattered blanket. Pale blue skin shimmered faintly in the dim light. Ethan blinked in surprise. It wasn't human. The figure stirred, weak and trembling. Large, glowing eyes opened and fixed on him, filled with fear and confusion. Ethan raised his hands, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "It's okay," he said softly. I'm here to help." The alien woman didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, and she looked on the verge of collapse. Ethan didn't need words to understand her condition. She had been trapped here for a long time, clinging to life in the hopes that someone would find her. "Let's get you out of here," he said, carefully lifting her into his arms. As he carried her back to his ship, the howling winds outside seemed to grow louder, almost as if the planet itself was protesting his interference. But Ethan didn't care. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to leave her behind. Ethan placed the alien woman gently on the medbed in his ship's small infirmary. Her breathing was faint but steady. The faint blue glow of her skin pulsed weakly, a sign of life hanging by a thread. He adjusted the bed's monitoring systems to scan her vitals, but the machine struggled to process her alien biology. "Figures," Ethan muttered. "You're not from around here, are you?" He stood over her for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He was used to fixing machines, not people, especially not alien ones. The woman's clothes were tattered and grimy, and her hair clung to her face in messy strands. She looked fragile, like she'd been through far more than anyone should endure. Ethan took a deep breath and started rummaging through the ship's emergency medical supplies. He wasn't a doctor, but basic survival training had taught him a few things. He prepared a hydration injection, something universal enough to work on most species, and administered it carefully. The woman flinched slightly but didn't wake. As he worked, questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? How had she ended up trapped in that pod on a dead planet? And why hadn't anyone come for her? The thought of leaving someone behind like that made his stomach turn. Suddenly, the ship's console beeped, pulling him from his thoughts. Ethan hurried to the cockpit, glancing at the radar. His heart sank. A small cluster of ships was approaching the planet. Fast. They weren't broadcasting any identification codes, and their erratic flight patterns screamed trouble. "Scavengers," he muttered. Perfect timing. Ethan had seen their kind before. Scavengers were opportunists, picking over abandoned places for scraps of value. If they found him, they wouldn't hesitate to take his ship, or worse. He quickly started powering up the Stellar Dawn, its engines rumbling to life. Returning to the infirmary, he looked at the alien woman. She was still unconscious, her breathing a little steadier now. He tightened the blanket around her and muttered, "Looks like we've got company. Don't worry, I'll get us out of here." The ship shuddered as it lifted off the ground, dust swirling around it. Ethan guided it carefully through the planet's dense atmosphere, keeping an eye on the approaching scavengers. The radar showed their ships closing in. He adjusted his course, heading toward a nearby asteroid belt. If he could lose them there, they might stand a chance. The stellar dawn broke through the planet's atmosphere, and the emptiness of space opened up before them. Ethan glanced at the radar again. 3 ships, all gaining on him. He cursed under his breath and pushed the engines harder. The ship groaned in protest but held steady. "Come on, girl, don't let me down now," he said, patting the console like it could hear him. Behind him, the scavengers opened fire. Bright streaks of plasma zipped past the stellar dawn, narrowly missing its hull. Ethan gritted his teeth and swerved the ship, using the asteroid belt ahead as cover. Massive rocks drifted lazily in the void, their jagged surfaces illuminated by the distant sun. "This is going to be tight," Ethan muttered. He weaved the ship between the asteroids, his hand steady on the controls. The scavengers followed, their smaller ships more agile but less durable. Ethan used that to his advantage, steering dangerously close to the larger asteroids. One scavenger ship miscalculated and clipped an asteroid, exploding in a fiery burst. 2 down, Ethan said under his breath. The remaining 2 scavenger ships pressed on, firing relentlessly. One shot grazed the stellar dawn, sending a jolt through the cabin. Alarms blared, and Ethan quickly rerouted power to the shields. Hold together," he whispered. He spotted a cluster of asteroids ahead, forming a narrow passage barely wide enough for his ship. It was a gamble, but it was his best shot. Ethan accelerated, pushing the Stellar Dawn into the passage. The scavengers hesitated, but one of them followed, determined to catch their prey. Ethan navigated the tight space with precision, his eyes darting between the controls and the view ahead. The scavenger ship behind him wasn't as lucky. A stray asteroid smashed into its side, tearing it apart. The final scavenger, realizing the chase wasn't worth the risk, veered off and disappeared into the void. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The ship was still intact, and they were alive. For now. He steered the Stellar Dawn out of the asteroid belt and set a course for a safer sector of space. Back in the infirmary, the alien woman stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glowing faintly in the dim light. Ethan sat beside her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Hey, you're awake," he said. "Don't worry, you're safe now." She looked at him, her expression a mix of confusion and gratitude. Though she didn't speak, her eyes seemed to convey a silent question. "Why did you save me?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, letting out a tired chuckle. "Guess I couldn't just leave you there. That's not how I'm built." The woman's eyes softened, and for the first time, Ethan felt like maybe he wasn't so alone out here in the vast, unforgiving galaxy. The hum of the Stellar Dawn's engines filled the quiet infirmary as Ethan sat at the medbed, watching the alien woman carefully. Her breathing had stabilized, and she looked more at peace now than when he'd first found her. The faint blue glow of her skin flickered softly, like a dying ember trying to come back to life. She blinked slowly, her glowing eyes scanning the room with a mix of curiosity and caution. When her gaze landed on Ethan, she tensed, her hands clutching the edge of the blanket tightly. Ethan raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're safe now. I'm not going to hurt you." Her eyes narrowed slightly as if she didn't fully believe him. Ethan couldn't blame her. Whatever she had been through, it had clearly left her scared. He grabbed a bottle of water from the nearby table and offered it to her. "Here," he said, unscrewing the cap and holding it out. "You need this." She hesitated, her glowing eyes darting between him and the bottle. Finally, as if deciding to take a chance, she reached out with trembling fingers and took it. Ethan noticed how frail her hands looked, the skin almost translucent under the faint blue light. She sipped the water cautiously, her movements slow and deliberate. "Good," Ethan said, nodding. "That's a start." The woman looked at him again, this time with less fear and more curiosity. She pointed at herself weakly and spoke a single word, her voice soft and melodic but unfamiliar. "Ilara," she said. Ethan tilted his head. "Ilara, is that your name?" She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. Ethan smiled slightly and tapped his own chest. "I'm Ethan," he said. "Ethan Monroe." Ilara repeated his name quietly, as if testing the sound. It came out slightly garbled, but Ethan didn't mind. It was a start. The ship's console beeped again, interrupting the moment. Ethan sighed and stood, glancing at the radar. No sign of the scavengers, which was a relief, but the ship's power levels were running low. The damage from the earlier chase had taken a toll, and he needed to find a safe place to make repairs. "I need to check on the ship," he told Ilara, pointing toward the cockpit. "You stay here and rest, all right?" She didn't respond but watched him intently as he left the infirmary. In the cockpit, Ethan scanned the surrounding space. There wasn't much in this sector, just a few scattered asteroid fields and a distant star that offered little in terms of resources. He tapped a few buttons on the console, pulling up a map of nearby systems. The closest station was still several light-years away, and the Stellar Dawn wouldn't make it without repairs. "Great," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "What now?" As if on cue, a faint signal crackled through the ship's comms. Ethan frowned and adjusted the frequency, trying to make sense of the garbled message. It wasn't another SOS, but it was definitely alien. The tone was rhythmic and almost musical, unlike any human language he'd ever heard. He glanced back toward the infirmary. Ilara might know something about this. Returning to the med bed, Ethan found Ilara sitting up slightly, her eyes more alert now. She watched him as he entered, tilting her head curiously when she saw the small device in his hand. "I picked up a signal," Ethan said, holding out the comm device. "Do you recognize it?" He played the message, and Ilara's eyes widened. She sat up straighter, her hands clutching the blanket tightly. She pointed at the device, then at herself, speaking rapidly in her language. Ethan couldn't understand the words, but her urgency was clear. "Whoa, slow down," he said, holding up his hands. "You know what this is?" Ilara nodded quickly, her glowing eyes filled with desperation. She gestured toward the cockpit, then made a motion with her hands as if mimicking the ship taking off. Ethan's brow furrowed as he tried to piece it together. "You want me to follow the signal?" he guessed. She nodded again, her expression pleading. Ethan hesitated. Following an unknown signal in hostile space wasn't exactly his idea of a good plan, but Ilara's reaction made it clear that it was important. Maybe the signal was from someone she knew, or maybe it was a clue to whatever had happened to her. "All right," he said, sighing. "We'll follow it. But if this gets us into trouble, I'm blaming you." Ilara didn't seem to understand his words, but she smiled faintly, the first sign of warmth he'd seen from her. It was enough to convince him that he was doing the right thing. Back in the cockpit, Ethan set the ship on a course toward the signal. The stellar dawn hummed softly as it adjusted its trajectory, moving toward the unknown. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something far bigger than he'd signed up for. As the ship sailed through the vastness of space, Ilara appeared in the doorway of the cockpit. She leaned against the frame, her glowing eyes fixed on the stars ahead. For the first time, Ethan saw a glimmer of hope in her expression. "Let's see where this takes us," he said, more to himself than to her. The stars stretched endlessly before them, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he wasn't alone. The stellar dawn glided through the vast emptiness of space, following the mysterious signal. The ship's engines hummed steadily, but Ethan couldn't shake the tension building in his chest. His hands hovered over the controls, ready to react to anything unexpected. Beside him, Ilara sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her glowing eyes fixed on the screen displaying the signal's coordinates. She had been silent for most of the journey, but her expression told Ethan everything he needed to know. This signal mattered to her. Whether it was a beacon of hope or a warning, he wasn't sure, but he was determined to find out. "Almost there," Ethan said, more to himself than to Ilara. "Let's hope this isn't another trap." Ilara turned to him, her gaze softening slightly. She reached out and touched his arm gently, as if to reassure him. Ethan glanced at her and gave a small nod. "Yeah, I know. We've got this," he said, even though he wasn't entirely convinced. The signal led them to the edge of a dense asteroid field. Massive rocks drifted lazily in the void, their surfaces jagged and covered in ice. Ethan frowned as he scanned the area. The signal was coming from deep within the field, but navigating through it would be dangerous. One wrong move, and the stellar dawn could end up as just another piece of space debris. "You're really making me work for this, aren't you?" Ethan muttered under his breath. He tightened his grip on the controls and carefully guided the ship into the asteroid field. The thrusters fired in short bursts as he maneuvered around the massive rocks, his eyes darting between the radar and the viewport. Ilara leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the console as she watched the asteroids drift past. The deeper they went, the stronger the signal became. It was no longer just a faint transmission. It was pulsing rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Ethan's curiosity grew, but so did his unease. What could be hiding out here in the middle of nowhere? Suddenly, a glimmer of light caught his eye. At the center of the field, nestled between two massive asteroids, was a large metallic structure. It looked like a station of some kind, though its design was unlike anything Ethan had seen before. The surface was smooth and reflective, with faint blue lights glowing along its edges. "That's it," Ethan said, his voice low. "That's where the signal's coming from." Ilara's eyes widened, and she pointed at the structure, speaking quickly in her language. Though Ethan couldn't understand her words, her urgency was clear. She wanted to go inside. Ethan brought the stellar dawn closer, carefully scanning the structure for any signs of life. The station appeared abandoned, but something about it felt alive. The pulsing signal seemed to resonate from within, as if the structure itself was breathing. After finding a docking port, Ethan secured the ship and prepared to disembark. He grabbed his gear and turned to Ilara, who was already on her feet, ready to follow him. "You're not staying here?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She shook her head firmly, her glowing eyes meeting his. Ethan sighed. "All right, but stay close. I don't know what we're walking into." The airlock hissed open, and the two stepped into the station. The interior was cold and dimly lit, with the same faint blue glow emanating from the walls. The design was sleek and alien, with smooth surfaces and strange, flowing symbols etched into the metal. Ilara moved with purpose, her steps quick but cautious. She seemed to recognize the symbols, running her fingers over them as if they held some kind of meaning. Ethan followed closely, his hand resting on the hilt of his plasma cutter, just in case. As they ventured deeper into the station, the pulsing signal grew louder. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration that seemed to resonate through the walls, through their very bones. Ilara stopped suddenly, her head tilting as if she was listening to something only she could hear. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She pointed down a long corridor, her expression tense. Ethan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right, let's check it out." The corridor led to a large, circular chamber. At the center of the room was a massive device, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols. It pulsed with energy, the source of the signal they had been following. Ilara approached the device cautiously, her hands outstretched as if she was drawn to it. Ethan stayed back, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The air felt heavy, almost electric, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, the device emitted a soft hum, and a holographic display flickered to life above it. The image showed a star map, with several points marked in bright blue. Ilara gasped, her glowing eyes reflecting the light of the map. She turned to Ethan, her expression filled with urgency and determination. "This means something to you, doesn't it?" Ethan said. Ilara nodded quickly, pointing at one of the marked points on the map. Whatever this was, it was important. And it was only the beginning. The holographic star map hovered above the mysterious device, casting an ethereal blue glow across the chamber. Ethan stared at it, trying to make sense of the marked points. To him, they were just stars, distant and unreachable. But to Ilara, they meant something more. Her glowing eyes were wide, filled with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite place. Hope, fear, determination. She stepped closer to the map, pointing to one of the marked points. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned to Ethan, speaking rapidly in her language. Though he couldn't understand her words, her urgency was clear. "All right," Ethan said, holding up his hands. "I get it. This is important to you. But what is it?" "A destination, a safe place, a warning." Ilara didn't answer. Instead, she touched the device again, and the map shifted. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, pulsating in rhythm with the device. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with energy. Ethan's instincts kicked in, and he tightened his grip on his plasma cutter. "Careful," he warned. "We don't know what this thing does." Ilara glanced back at him, her expression both apologetic and determined. She pressed her hand flat against the surface of the device, and a low hum filled the chamber. The holographic map expanded, revealing more details: planets, stations, and what looked like routes connecting the marked points. One of the routes glowed brighter than the others, leading to a single destination. Ethan squinted at the display. "Is that a path?" Are you trying to tell me we need to follow it? Ilara nodded, her glowing eyes locking onto his. She pointed at the highlighted route, then at herself, and finally at him. The message was clear. She needed his help to get there. Before Ethan could respond, the chamber shuddered. The glowing symbols on the walls flickered, and the hum grew louder. A deep, mechanical voice echoed through the room, speaking in a language Ethan didn't recognize. Ilara froze, her expression shifting to one of alarm. She grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him toward the exit. Okay, I get it. Time to go, Ethan said, following her lead. The two ran down the corridor, the floor vibrating beneath their feet. The station seemed to be coming alive, its systems reactivating after who knew how many years of dormancy. The once quiet walls now hummed with energy, and faint lights flickered in the distance. As they reached the docking bay, Ethan glanced back. He half expected something, or someone, to be chasing them, but the corridors remained empty. Still, he didn't feel safe. Whatever they had activated, it was bigger than anything he wanted to deal with. They boarded the Stellar Dawn, and Ethan immediately began the launch sequence. The ship's engines roared to life as it lifted off the docking port. Ilara stood by the window, watching the station shrink in the distance. Her expression was hard to read, but Ethan could sense the weight of her thoughts. As they cleared the asteroid field, Ethan finally relaxed a little. The radar showed no signs of pursuit, and the ship's systems were stable for now. He turned to Ilara, who was still staring out the window. "All right," he said, breaking the silence. "You've got some explaining to do. What was that place? And what's so important about that star map?" Ilara turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with resolve. She tapped on the console, bringing up the holographic map she had activated earlier. The highlighted route appeared again, leading to the same destination. She pointed to the endpoint, and then to herself, speaking slowly this time. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You need to go there, don't you? But why? What's waiting for you?" Ilara hesitated, as if searching for a way to explain. She pressed her hand to her chest, then made a motion as if spreading something outward. Ethan frowned, trying to interpret her gestures. "Your people," he guessed. "Are you trying to say that's where your people are?" Ilara nodded, her expression softening. She pointed to Ethan, then to the map, silently pleading for his help. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the display. The coordinates were far, deep into uncharted space. It wouldn't be an easy journey, and there was no guarantee of safety. But leaving her stranded now, after everything they'd been through, wasn't an option. "All right," he said finally. "We'll go. But if this gets us into trouble, I'm blaming you." Ilara smiled faintly, her gratitude evident. For the first time, Ethan felt like they were truly a team. Whatever awaited them at the end of that route, they would face it together. As the Stellar Dawn set its course, Ethan couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and dread. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, but it was also full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was heading towards something that mattered. The Stellar Dawn cruised through the quiet expanse of space, its engines purring steadily as Ethan piloted toward the unknown coordinates. The glowing map hovered on the console before him, its highlighted path leading deeper into uncharted territory. He glanced over at Ilara, who was sitting quietly in the co-pilot's seat. Her glowing blue eyes were fixed on the map, her expression a mix of hope and anxiety. Ethan tapped his fingers on the console, breaking the silence. "You know, it'd be nice if I had a little more to go on. What exactly are we heading into here?" Ilara turned to him, her lips pressing into a thin line. She gestured toward the map, and then placed her hand on her chest, speaking softly in her language. Though Ethan couldn't understand the words, her tone was heavy with meaning. He sighed. "Yeah, I get it. This place is important to you. I just hope it's worth the risk." As if on cue, the radar beeped, pulling Ethan's attention to the screen. A cluster of small ships had appeared on the edge of the display, moving fast in their direction. His jaw tightened. Scavengers again, or worse. "Looks like we've got company," he muttered, gripping the controls. "Hang on, this might get rough." Ilara's eyes widened as she leaned forward, her hands clutching the edge of the console. The approaching ships didn't bother with subtlety. They opened fire immediately, streaks of plasma lighting up the void. Ethan swerved the Stellar Dawn, narrowly avoiding the first volley. "Great," he said through gritted teeth. "Guess they don't want to talk." Ilara pointed toward the map, then back at the radar, speaking urgently. Ethan glanced at her, his mind racing to piece together her meaning. "You think we can lose them if we stick to the route?" he asked. She nodded firmly, her glowing eyes filled with determination. Ethan didn't have a better plan, so he pushed the engines harder, following the highlighted path on the map. The ship groaned under the strain, but it held together as it weaved through the open expanse. The scavenger ships were smaller and more agile, but they lacked the Stellar Dawn's durability. Ethan used that to his advantage, diving toward a nearby asteroid cluster. The massive rocks floated lazily in space, creating a natural obstacle course. "This is going to be tight," Ethan muttered, guiding the ship into the field. The scavengers followed, their plasma cannons firing relentlessly. Ethan swerved and rolled the Stellar Dawn, narrowly avoiding both the asteroids and the incoming fire. One of the scavenger ships wasn't so lucky, slamming into an asteroid and exploding in a burst of flame. "One down," Ethan said, his grip tightening on the controls. Ilara glanced at him, her expression a mix of fear and admiration. She reached out and pointed toward a narrow gap between two massive asteroids, motioning for Ethan to head that way. He hesitated for a split second before nodding. "All right, but if we crash, this is on you," he said, steering toward the gap. The Stellar Dawn squeezed through the tight passage, its shield sparking as it grazed the edges. The remaining scavenger ships hesitated, unwilling to risk the same maneuver. Ethan used the opportunity to accelerate, putting more distance between them. As they emerged from the asteroid field, the radar showed the scavenger ships falling back. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That was too close," he said, easing the ship back to a steady speed. He glanced at Ilara, who was still gripping the console tightly. "You all right?" She nodded slowly, her glowing eyes meeting his. Though she didn't speak, the look on her face said it all. She trusted him. Ethan wasn't sure he deserved that trust, but he wasn't about to let her down. The ship continued along the highlighted route, the coordinates drawing closer with each passing moment. Ethan's thoughts wandered as he piloted. Who had sent that signal? And why had it led them here, to this uncharted part of space? As if reading his mind, Ilara reached over and touched his arm lightly. She pointed toward the map, then made a motion as if opening a door. Ethan frowned, trying to interpret her gestures. "You think this place is a key," he guessed, "or maybe a gateway." Ilara nodded, her expression serious. Whatever awaited them at the coordinates, it was more than just a destination. It was the answer to a mystery she had been carrying with her since he found her. As the Stellar Dawn neared the coordinates, the ship's systems began to flicker. The lights dimmed, and the console's display glitched. Ethan's brow furrowed as he checked the controls. "What now?" he muttered, adjusting the settings. "We're not even there yet." Ilara stood, her glowing eyes scanning the room. She pointed toward the viewport, her expression urgent. Ethan followed her gaze and froze. Ahead of them was a massive structure, floating silently in the void. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Vast and intricate, its surface covered in glowing blue patterns that pulsed rhythmically. It seemed alive, almost as if it were watching them. "Well," Ethan said, his voice low, "I guess we found what we were looking for." Ilara stepped closer to the viewport, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and determination. Whatever this place was, it held the answers she had been searching for, and the journey was far from over. The massive structure floated in the void, its glowing patterns casting a faint blue light across the darkness of space. Ethan stared at it through the viewport, his jaw tightening. The ship's systems were still flickering, as if the structure's presence was disrupting everything around it. Beside him, Ilara leaned forward, her glowing eyes wide with awe and recognition. "You know what this is, don't you?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet. Ilara nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving the structure. She pointed toward it, then placed her hand on her chest, her movements deliberate and full of meaning. Ethan didn't need words to understand. This was why the signal had called her. This was her destination. The stellar dawn drifted closer, its engines humming softly. Ethan guided the ship carefully, scanning the structure for any signs of life or danger. The closer they got, the more the ship's systems seemed to react. Lights flickered, and the console beeped erratically. Ethan frowned, adjusting the controls. "This place is messing with the ship," he muttered. "We won't be able to stay long." Ilara touched his arm, her expression calm but determined. She pointed toward an opening in the structure, a large circular gateway that glowed faintly. Ethan hesitated, his instincts warning him against going any closer, but the look in Ilara's eyes stopped him. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger than both of them. "All right," he said, sighing. "But if this goes sideways, we're out of here." He guided the stellar dawn toward the gateway, the ship's systems straining with every passing moment. As they entered the structure, the blue light grew brighter, enveloping the ship in a soft glow. The interior was vast and intricate, with walls that seemed to ripple like water. Symbols and patterns flowed across the surfaces, moving in time with the pulsing light. Ethan brought the ship to a stop inside a large chamber, its center dominated by a massive, glowing sphere. The sphere floated in the air, its surface shimmering like liquid glass. Ilara stood, her gaze fixed on it. Without hesitation, she moved toward the airlock. "Hey, wait," Ethan called, standing to follow her. "We don't know what that thing is." But Ilara didn't stop. She turned to him briefly, her glowing eyes soft but resolute. She gestured for him to stay before stepping out of the ship. Ethan hesitated, torn between following her and staying behind. Every instinct told him this was dangerous, but he couldn't let her face it alone. Grabbing his gear, he followed her out into the chamber. The air inside the structure was warm and thick, carrying a faint hum that seemed to vibrate through Ethan's bones. Ilara moved toward the sphere, her steps steady and purposeful. As she approached, the sphere began to shift, its surface rippling like water. A soft, melodic hum filled the chamber, resonating with the glowing patterns on the walls. Ethan stopped a few steps behind her, his hand resting on the hilt of his plasma cutter. "Ilara, are you sure about this?" She glanced back at him, her expression calm. She placed her hand on the sphere, and the chamber filled with a burst of light. Ethan shielded his eyes, the brightness overwhelming. When it faded, the sphere had transformed. Its surface now displayed images, memories, perhaps. Ethan watched as scenes unfolded within the sphere. They showed a thriving alien civilization, one that looked strikingly similar to Ilara. The images were vibrant and full of life, but they quickly turned dark. He saw ships descending from the sky, bringing destruction and chaos. He saw people fleeing, their faces filled with fear. And then he saw the structure they were standing in, a last beacon of hope for a dying race. Ethan's heart sank as the final image appeared. Ilara, trapped in the black box, her glowing eyes filled with desperation. She had been left behind, abandoned on that desolate planet, while her people vanished into the stars. "Your people, they sent you here," Ethan said softly, piecing it together. This place was meant to save them. Ilara nodded, tears shimmering in her glowing eyes. She gestured toward the sphere, then at Ethan, as if asking for his help. "You think I can fix this?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "Ilara, I'm just a guy with a ship. I'm no engineer." But Ilara stepped closer to him, her gaze steady. She placed her hand over his, her silent plea unwavering. Ethan swallowed hard, his doubts clashing with the trust in her eyes. He wasn't sure he could do this, but he couldn't walk away now. Not after everything they'd been through. "All right," he said finally. "Let's give it a shot." Together, they worked on the sphere, Ethan using his knowledge of technology and Ilara guiding him with her understanding of the symbols. The process was slow and delicate, but with every adjustment, the structure seemed to come alive. The glowing patterns on the walls grew brighter, and the hum in the air intensified. Finally, the sphere pulsed with light, sending a wave of energy through the chamber. Ethan stepped back, his heart pounding as the structure began to shift. The walls rippled, and the gateway they had entered through glowed brighter. "Ilara, I think it's working," Ethan said, his voice filled with awe. The chamber filled with a soft, melodic sound, like a chorus of voices singing in harmony. Ilara turned to Ethan, her face radiant with hope. For the first time, she smiled, a true, genuine smile that lit up the room. As the energy of the structure stabilized, Ethan realized what they had done. They hadn't just activated the structure, they had reignited a beacon of hope. Somewhere out there, Ilara's people might still be waiting for this signal, and together, they had given them a chance to find their way home.